active land retirement and stream augmentation projects. And other states in the High Plains have done the same thing. Now, next is transferable permit systems. If you have certified your irrigated acreage or you have metered your wells and you've achieved an allocation of irrigation rights, then from an economic point of view, it is cost effective to allow transfers of those groundwater pumping rights. So in other contexts, we might call this a cap and trade system. Within an agricultural context, and a U.S. context, cap and trade is a politicized term. So we typically call them transferable permit systems or groundwater pumping rights transfers. But the concept is the same, that within the aggregate irrigation allocation, you should be able to reallocate those rights in a way that achieves both economic efficiency or improves economic efficiency and allows environmental goals to be reached. And I will come back and talk about this a little more towards the end of the seminar too. Now, a conjunctive use system is one in which we manage surface water and groundwater together. Typically, how conjunctive use systems work is that when you have surface water, you use it, and when you don't have surface water in your canal, you pump groundwater instead. In the last few years in the High Plains, we've seen some more interesting versions of conjunctive use systems that are focused on using canal systems to recharge aquifers. So in this case, what's been done is that flood flows are being captured in canal systems and used to recharge groundwater. Now, this isn't unique to the High Plains. It happens elsewhere in the world. But in a High Plains context, it requires a degree of coordination because typically the surface water is managed by the state and the groundwater is managed locally. And so that creates a coordination issue and a transaction cost that must be overcome. But in terms of providing additional options for groundwater recharge, this is a set of systems that I think has a lot of potential to grow, and I think will continue to grow if we look at the timing and magnitude of flood flows going into the future. Now, finally, there are two systems of or management types that are often overlooked. First of all is best management practices. So in some cases, there are, and in particular for water quality management, districts have managed to put in voluntary or quasi-voluntary best management practices to do with timings and amounts, for example, of fertilizer application, or the kinds of technology that can be used, or an encouragement of low-till or no-till. And taken together, again, these things absolutely make a difference to water conservation and making it easier to manage the groundwater system. And then finally, we can talk about education and outreach activities. And again, often we may not think about these as being related to innovative management, but in some cases there are extremely innovative education and outreach activities that relate directly to groundwater management. So I'll talk about a couple of these now. First of all, we see efforts at the not only the state and local level, so from the regulatory side, we also see efforts by university groups, and we also see private efforts that are led by agricultural producers groups. So let me give you a couple of examples of these efforts. The first one that I'd suggest is the Nebraska Water Balance Alliance, which is primarily a producers group based in central Nebraska, who have been active now for a number of years, sharing their field level data on their input use and their input use efficiency, and essentially trying to understand themselves how they can manage their water better, and then working with other producers that would also like to manage their water better. There are similar groups in Texas, and in fact the two groups have reached out to each other recently, and so on some level these are very strong potential activities. From a regulatory perspective, they don't cost the regulators any money, and so they're also very appealing. There are also other efforts, as I said, from the university level. At a local level, some of the districts have now begun requiring mandatory training on water conservation techniques or input application every year as part of the irrigation allocation process. In other words, in order to get your irrigation rights for a year, you have to have had some training on water conservation techniques. So this is something that, again, we'll see what the impacts are going into the future, but I think there's a lot of potential there for future gains. So I want to talk a little bit about two of these groundwater management approaches. The first of these is, and these are two things that I've, in my own personal research, I've thought about quite a bit and worked on. The first is agricultural groundwater metering. And the quote that I have here, "It's not feasible to monitor and enforce groundwater pumping restrictions," is something that I have come across very regularly in my travels and presentations, that one of the misconceptions about groundwater management is that when it comes to agricultural production, it's really impossible to restrict and enforce and monitor groundwater pumping restrictions. Now, I think over time that's changing, partly as a result of education efforts, but really, if you have the willpower and you have the ability to work with the local communities in a U.S. context, it is quite possible to restrict groundwater pumping. So the example that I have here, this is a map of the Upper Republican Natural Resources District. Each blue dot is an irrigation well. There are about 3,200 dots there, representing over 1 million irrigated acres. This district actually decided to start metering in 1978 and was fully metered by 1982. It was certainly one of the first areas in the world where mandatory metering was required of all agricultural producers. Now, that particular district now has almost a 35-year record of metering, but agricultural groundwater metering is expanding rapidly elsewhere. Just about every time I give this talk, the list expands. As I mentioned, in Kansas, every agricultural well has a meter. Australia, similarly, New Zealand, China. Texas is now starting to meter in areas. I should say, of course, that meters can be very, very controversial. So even within Nebraska, where we have in one part of Nebraska metering going back to the late 70s, in adjacent districts to the Upper Republican Natural Resources District, there are very strong policies that metering will not occur. So, as I said, metering is and this is perhaps a topic for another entire conversation, but metering, because of data privacy issues and potential litigation, can be a very controversial topic, even though it's generally agreed that as soon as you install meters, typically aggregate water use goes down because people understand how much water they're using at a finer level than they did before. I should also note that if you have certified irrigated acreage, it is possible to monitor pumping restrictions without meters. You have some uncertainty associated with that. You have to make some assumptions about either the plant density or the irrigation strategy, but in some cases it may be sufficient. So it is possible to reduce pumping without enforcing metering. The second thing I want to talk about now is the agricultural groundwater trading, or trading in the right to pump groundwater. This is something that I've personally worked on for a number of years. So here what we're talking about is areas where there are restrictions on the total amount of irrigated land or the total volume of water that can be pumped, where the regulatory body has imposed the ability to reallocate water through some market-based mechanism. So within Nebraska, in the U.S. High Plains region, there are a number of water markets that are either active or in development within the Republican River Basin and the Platte River Basin. And then in other basins, there are markets in development. Within Kansas, there are similarly a couple of nascent markets, or I guess there's one nascent market and one market that started and stopped due to insufficient transactions. And again, that's perhaps a topic for another talk. As we go more broadly, of course, Australia, through its National Water Initiative, now has trading in the Murray-Darling Basin, and there are groundwater markets elsewhere in Australia. And within the US, certainly there's transfers in Texas, Arizona, Nevada, and California, I believe in Georgia. Again, this is one of those things that every time I present, I add another name to the list, and if you're aware of groundwater transfers in your area, please do let me know. And then also in areas like China, India, Pakistan, Oman, and Chile. Now, that's a very wide list. I have at other times given entire seminars about agricultural groundwater trading and how it works, and in particular, how you set up transfer schemes to deal with spatial complexity and the dynamics of dealing with stream depletion. I don't have time to go into that here, but what I will say is that most of the water markets are coffee shop markets or bulletin boards. So these are systems that are subject to very high transaction costs. So it's very hard for buyers and sellers to meet each other. And in particular, if there are important environmental constraints, it's very, very hard to meet those constraints. However, in Nebraska, there have now been smart markets that use algorithmic clearing implemented that offer anonymous confidential bidding and reduce the transaction costs significantly. Again, this is something that I've personally been involved with my research, but given the time we have today, I can't talk more about those. So with an eye on the time, let me get to my key messages. Well, first of all, I'd like to again reiterate that when we look at the policy landscape and things that have resulted in meaningful changes in how the people that use groundwater behave, most often to date, groundwater depletion has not been the driver of binding policy change. Now, on some level, if we're to solve issues such as groundwater depletion in California, that will have to change. So you can say that that first key message is a historical message that perhaps speaks to the challenge for managing groundwater in the future. The second key message is that there is rapid and fine-scale innovation and experimentation in groundwater management across the US. So many, many different kinds of policies are currently being tried all across the US. These are not in academic context. These are not done by people with trainings in policy. They're intended to deal with local issues in a local way. And many of them are things that we haven't actually thought about in an academic context and that we can learn from. So at least personally, that's something that I've greatly enjoyed doing and trying to understand why specific regulations have been set up in specific places to deal with those local issues. Again, in this talk, I gave lots of examples from Nebraska, which through its institutional framework does lend itself to rapid innovation, but there are lots of examples elsewhere as well. When we look at what it takes to get innovation on the ground and to have it stick, probably the most important thing is to have local control and effective governance. That's something that we will, I think, see more of in the future, and certainly something that as California looks towards its groundwater sustainability agencies, it will need to think about carefully. And then my final message is one to look to the future, and again, in particular for academics in the audience. My experience has been that how regulations are actually implemented is often very different to how they're written down. And this creates also a challenge for us in terms of how we manage and understand the resources and what's driving changes in the resources and in the behavior of those that use them. So thank you very much. With that, I'll stop and take questions.
Thanks very much, Nick. It looks like there's one question on there, so let's start with that. This is from Lulu, who says, do you think there is a need for the implementation of a groundwater policy at a national level?
So that is a great question. I think about that a lot. In the US context, I think it would be very hard politically because of the state system to have a national groundwater policy. I'm not sure there's a need for one. Again, what's needed is enough threat. I guess perhaps a better way of putting the answer is that the threat of a national groundwater policy might be enough that you would never need one. Now, in other contexts, and I'm thinking of Australia, they have a national framework for groundwater management. But even there, when you look at the places, the groundwater management institutions have to be tailored to the local cases. So I have a question from Adam here. Manu, I'll just read these out if that's okay with you. So Adam says, from where do the natural resources districts receive their funding? So that's a very good question. The natural resources districts, because they are local government entities, they receive tax funding. And they do that in a couple of different ways. The first is that they get money from real estate tax. So some portion of the real estate tax that's collected on the land valuation each year goes towards their operations and maintenance. They have another mechanism, which is that they're allowed to charge an occupation tax. So currently within Nebraska, if you are a natural resources district, you can charge up to $10 an irrigated acre a year for programs. Now, as you can imagine, that has been controversial, but those occupation taxes in the more heavily irrigated districts create millions of dollars of income that can be used for groundwater management programs. I guess I have another question here that says, how does state level regulation deal with transboundary groundwater resources? So that's a great question. So typically what's happened in a U.S. context is that when there have been transboundary issues, there has been litigation between states. So in the Republican River Basin, Kansas, the state of Kansas, sued Colorado and Nebraska over the impacts of their groundwater pumping on surface water that belonged to Kansas. Now this litigation, actually, it's been up to the Supreme Court twice. The more important ruling was the first one. So the first ruling actually ruled that the surface water and the groundwater were hydrologically connected, which in itself, if you know anything about Western water law, is not typically the case. But then as a result of that, the state was compelled to manage the groundwater in a way that it would reduce impacts. And at least in Nebraska, it did that through the NRD system. That then the delegation of that responsibility fell to the NRDs, with the threat that if the NRDs didn't reduce their stream depletion enough, something worse would happen and they would lose control. Adam. So Adam's question is, has anyone been cataloging the fine-scale innovations in groundwater management in the U.S.? This is a fabulous question. I would say no. I know that several of us are working on it. I would love to see a more concerted effort to do that. The problem here is that it's very, very hard to know, even within one state, everything that's going on, let alone across states. And the other part, I guess there are two other things that I alluded to. First of all, that how regulations are actually implemented is often very different to how they're written. So in this case, the internet is not your friend, and Dr. Google doesn't throw up the right answers. That in order to understand what's actually on the ground, you have to go and talk to the people that are managing the resources, the technical staff and the boards of directors. And that is very time consuming. And then the other thing is the regulations change very quickly. So even from year to year, they change. So it's a great research gap for the community.
Okay, so looks like the audience doesn't. I guess there are two people still typing, but in the meantime, let me ask you something. The one issue you brought up, which is with respect to metering and billing potentially, because it's not just a metering issue. You could eventually argue that there should be a payment for groundwater, and that would help figure out how the allocations work better in a way, and crop choices adjust to that. In the Indian context, what we found was that several pump manufacturers were happy to build in meters directly into the pump because it makes sense to integrate that and have a wireless capability or a cell phone capability to SMS that information directly to whoever needs it. However, there were no takers from the policymakers for such a thing, and hence they dropped that. Do you think in the US, particularly in California or Nebraska now, there might be takers for such a thing?
So this is a great question. The Indian context is very different because of the structure of energy policy and its link to rural development. And many, you know this much better than me, but what can be done there looks a little bit different. The Chinese context is different again. And so one thing that we're seeing in places like China, Oman, is this move towards these smart meter card schemes, and they call them IC card schemes, where you put a debit card reader on the wellhead and then you pass out debit cards to producers. My instinct is that in a US context, most producers now have, or many producers now have private meters on their wells. And a lot of the irrigation equipment manufacturers do that, but that's private information, not public information. So there is a data privacy issue first. Second of all, when you look at the price elasticity of demand for water use in agriculture, that's pretty inelastic. And so if, again, in a US context, not a smallholder agriculture context, but in a high efficiency agricultural context, the tax that you'd have to place on water in order to have a meaningful impact is very, very large and politically unacceptable. And one of the misconceptions that, at least in the California context, I've heard a lot is this idea that groundwater is free and that agricultural producers are getting their groundwater free. And certainly they're not paying any public entity, but the energy costs embodied in getting the groundwater to the surface are very, very large. And in a California context, there are producers that are paying $1,000 an acre foot or more for pumped groundwater. And so it's hard to argue that it's free to those producers. So I think there's a little bit more complexity in that. But again, I've spent a little bit of time thinking about the contrast between the smallholder agriculture and the high efficiency, large producer agriculture. And I think there's things to be learned. It's an interesting case of potential technological leapfrogging that some of the most advanced groundwater management schemes that we find that have real-time smart meter access and joint management of energy and water are now in the developing world. So I find that fascinating.
That's interesting. So there's a few more questions on the type stuff.
So I guess the next question says, thinking about Nigeria, I understand that there are policies for virtually everything, but groundwater is currently being tapped into indiscriminately by individuals for private use and private entities since deregulation of the water sector. What challenges do you think we could face in the future, particularly when there is thinking in the policy arena that we have water in abundant, I think, quantities? Yeah, so this is one of these issues that without having the ability to have some governance in place, is very hard to know what to do. So in the Nigerian context, to the extent that groundwater is viewed as a private resource or is not regulated appropriately, right now I don't think it'll be easy to do anything. That's not a great answer, but I can't come up with a better one for you right now. At some point what happens is that your saturated thicknesses start to drop, your well yields drop, and then your ability of your groundwater to buffer those climate shocks gets reduced very, very quickly. So again, we have some work that we're doing here at the Water for Food Institute that I haven't talked about here, that there are windows of opportunity for groundwater management, that when the resource is plentiful, there's nothing to be gained by managing it, or very little to be gained. And if you leave it too late, you've essentially depleted the aquifer. So this is, you look at somewhere like southwest Kansas, and parts of the high plains there are really managing the return to dryland agriculture. So there's a window that if you can set up the regulations and set up the government structure in that window, you can sustain the resource for the long run. But in some cases, that window may be very narrow. And then here we have a question from Stephen that says, in Ontario, water takings above a certain volume are regulated and water takings must be reported annually. Does any equivalent regulation apply in the US? So Stephen, the quick answer is no. Some states require annual reporting. So for example, Kansas requires annual reporting of agricultural water use. That's self-reporting. Within Nebraska, some of the districts have mandatory reporting and meters that are read by employees, so it's not self-reporting. Within Texas, similarly, some of the groundwater conservation districts are now moving towards mandatory annual reporting. To me, this is one of the large challenges that faces California moving forward with its Sustainable Groundwater Management Act and implementing it, is how you move from a situation where no reporting has ever been required to a situation where reporting is required and it's understood that the reason to report is to reduce groundwater use.
So it looks like we are out of questions and out of time on our block from Quasi. So thanks very much, Nick. This was very interesting to hear and gives me a lot of ideas for what I would like to discuss with you. Unfortunately, I think we won't see you next week, but and I'm traveling through the 28th of the month, but I would love to follow up and discuss.
At some point, I'd love to do that too. And again, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you today.
And thanks very much to all who joined for the talk.